Alright, so for whatever reason, this week I decided to go into the whole 80s tearjerker territory with these two, where obviously, you know, so many can fall into this category, but these two in particular seem to have a lot of particular similarities, mainly with the whole storyline of it sort of starts with a mother and daughter, and the daughter's getting married, and then it just seems like it's going to set off this whole, well, everybody's sort of starting a new life thing and seeing where that goes with all of the, you know, funny side characters and all that, but then ultimately the same daughter is going to eventually become gravely ill and die, and the movie starts with their weddings and ends with their funerals. And Shirley MacLaine finds her way into both of these at some point in one way or another. Also, the thing that I didn't quite put together immediately that I'd forgotten about until like halfway through revisiting them was that not only do they have that in common, but Robert Harling, the guy that wrote the script for Steel Magnolias, as well as the play itself that it's based on, ended up going on to write and direct The Evening Star, which was the sort of unnecessary sequel to Terms of Endearment many years later. So yeah, so there's a lot of things kind of holding these two in particular together. So I'm going to start with Terms of Endearment, which is obviously another thing in both these movies' cases is the idea of using humor in light of grief, and how that's like sort of a strong center to what they are and what they represent. But the interesting thing that Brooks does when he starts Terms of Endearment immediately, and I don't know if this was like the exact intention per se, but the way he like takes what is to eventually become the tragedy, and it's like the first funny moment in the movie, even though at the time, if it's a first viewing, we don't realize that that's the case. But with the opening scene being Aurora walking into Emma's room when she's a baby sleeping, and her immediate fear is that Emma is dead in her sleep. And like I said, at the start, we see that as like a really funny thing, because of course it's not, it's just her being overly paranoid. We've got Albert Brooks off-screen yelling at her to stop. And it's played up as this comedic moment where it's like, oh yep, she's alive, I can just leave her crying here now after I woke her up. Little realizing that that's going to be where the ultimate tragedy of the movie lies. And we have this, you know, nice starting point where after off-screen Albert Brooks has been killed, or dies, I guess I should say. That sounds much more sinister than it actually is, I'm assuming. We get this opening that shows, you know, the closeness, and maybe possibly a little too close between them, because obviously Aurora's going to have that sort of separation anxiety should things start to... Because Emma's eventually going to have to part ways, we obviously know, but in the meantime, we sort of have like this cloudy look to the opening, and it's sort of like this, you know, perfect heaven that they both live in together before Emma's an adult and going her separate ways. But we do get to those points immediately. Like Emma becomes Deborah Winger, like before the beginning credits are even over. And that might be one of the main problems. In certain areas it's an asset, I'm sure, but one of the things that also sort of feels like it's holding this movie back a little bit is that it constantly feels like it's moving in fast forward. And I understand, like, you know, getting to those points, especially if you're gonna, you know, span a number of years. But with a runtime of 2 hours and 10 minutes, it still feels incredibly fast. And like I said, not always to the effective extent. So what we focus on, we actually focus on Winger for a large portion of the beginning, but our real core of the movie seems to be Aurora, and with MacLane's performance also, and the way that she sort of definitely finds that balance of comedy and drama that's so important to this. It's my understanding that, I think I was reading that Brooks actually chose Shirley MacLaine because she seemed to be the only one that, like, saw this as a comedy, like, from beginning to end, more or less. Obviously the tragedy's in there, but the way she approached the material, where even in some of those serious moments she still manages to find the comedy in them, which was really the tone that Brooks seemed to be going for more than anything else. And as far as MacLane's performance goes, which obviously won her so far only Oscar, interestingly enough, It's a performance that I find myself appreciating more like as individual moments as opposed to a whole. Like one instance in particular is or really any of the scenes with Breedlove, but particularly the one where he comes over and basically tries to end it. And he says, you know, I don't want to blow smoke up your ass. And her response to that, where she sort of blends multiple reactions into one, where she kind of has that, you know, flippant way of saying, oh, what a relief. But in, like, that sarcasm, you can see the devastation in her face, too, when she kind of sits there quietly afterwards, where, like, she's trying to blow it off, but internally she can't. I think is one of those really strong moments that pop up throughout her performance, but that one's always the one that kind of stood out to me. But as I was saying, her performance really comes to life, and really the movie itself really comes to life with these scenes between her and Breedlove, the Nicholson character. And this really starts off because we see him, you know, periodically throughout, the kind of slowly inching his way into the movie. But in particular, this scene when we've already gotten to know that he likes women who are much younger than him, potentially illegally, and he's this drunk that sort of stumbles from gathering to gathering, trying to pick up as many women or whatever as he can. So we get to this scene where he asks Aurora out to lunch, and it seems like such a turning point for a character we barely know, but we know enough about to know that seems like it might be some interesting turning point. Because the thing here is, obviously, a guy like him is always going to have, you know, ulterior motives. But the thing here, and it does seem like it's a bit calculated, because obviously, you know, he does the whole sauna thing, then jumping into the pool, which he's always loud about. But this one particular scene almost seems like he's sort of intentionally calling her, like a literal mating call, basically, to get her attention and get her to come to the fence where he can ask her out. But the interesting thing is that despite the fact that we know the type of guy that this is, it's like when he goes to ask her out, the way he sort of like just slowly gets there when he says, like, hey, you know, what's crazy? And it's like, we were doing this whole, you know, dinner thing, and it got canceled, when I was going to ask you, isn't that crazy? Oh, well, maybe I should just ask you anyway. And it's almost like, the way he builds to it is he's gone from, like, this dude that just jumps around however he pleases, but when he's in front of Aurora, it's like he's a shy kid asking her out, more or less. And then when it does get to the end of the scene, and he realizes that he has scored lunch with her, he just reverts right back to his pervy self and is like, you know what, let's just skip all that and let's just go right to what we're thinking about. And it's almost like, it feels less like that's like him, and more like it's what in this particular moment, what he reverts to, like, out of instinct, like if he feels like he's gonna feel something. Because Aurora's obviously been next door to him for, like, years at this point, and God knows, like, what he's noticed or what she's noticed in between the two of them up to this moment. We know at least that he knows her name by this point, even if they've somehow never really come much in contact. So you get that sense in that alone, that there's something between them before we get to this moment, enough to where it feels like he's being more genuine with her than he would be with really anybody else or any other girl in the situation. So that's a really good sort of start for them, and then we get that particular scene when she's at, you know, dinner, and she's, you know, going at it with Flap again, and then DeVito's, like, hitting on her from a distance. And so it's like, it's almost like Breedlove offers her a double life, where she's got the life here, and then it's like in this one shot where we see her kind of go from one to the other when she comes outside, and DeVito and everybody has crowded around the window in this weird way to just watch her. And then she just crosses over, and it just seems like she goes to an entirely different world when she goes up to Breedlove's front door. And, like, it's a totally different offer of life to her, in a way. So, and then that's before we even get to the scene where they do go out, where, as we see, you know, obviously Breedlove is not, like, the ideal date, but Nicholson really has his way, because obviously it was offered to people like Burt Reynolds was supposed to do it, but apparently Stroker Race is what he was doing at the time. I'm sure he eventually regretted that, but And I could see Reynolds doing this too, but in particular, there's just that way that Nicholson has, where he can be, like, the totally sleazy guy, but also the charming guy at the same time. Um, and even in these moments when it seems like he can go, like, back and forth very quickly in Breedlove's tone, sometimes mid-sentence, like after they do the famous scene at the beach and he flies into the water and she gets mad about him being drunk, and he screams, "I'm not drunk," and then finishes the sentence, "anymore." Like, quietly, like, you barely hear him say "anymore" at the end of that sentence. And just in that one sentence alone, you can see the different tones he can play at once, which really fit this character in the ways that how quickly he can be pushed to blow up, but also, like I said, all these different personality traits that seem to be combating internally inside him. Even if just on the surface he seems to be the sleazy dude next door that just likes the underage girls. And I could see, apparently, he was so confident. I think in one of his memoirs he said that as soon as he read the script with, like, nothing else, he already knew he was going to win that supporting actor Oscar, that he did end up winning for it. So that pretty much speaks for itself. But then, of course, he's a character that become very heartwarming in just the right moments, like when, towards the end, when everything is going south, and then Aurora sees him at the top of the steps, and it's like, despite the kind of dude that he is, the fact that he's the kind of guy that also shows up when you need that support the most, really makes us see his character in a totally different way, even if not a whole lot has changed about him, still enough that he's easily one of the most intriguing characters in the movie. And so, like I said, anytime the two of them are on screen together is pretty much the high points of the movie. But that's not to take away from what Deborah Winger offers also, because it really feels like she's much more of the lead, especially in, like, the first half. At first, it does sort of seem like maybe she's a bit overly quirky, just a little bit. But then as it goes on, we do start to realize that it seemed like the plan was to kind of play her that way intentionally, and then as the movie goes on, she'll obviously progressively mature in certain ways and not so much in other ways, which really makes perfect sense, especially with the directions that she ends up going. But as she does start to get older, she does make the character feel a lot more real and less, like, I guess, movie-like, or whatever you want to say. Particularly in those moments when she, like, the more that happens to her, is, like, when she gets to be more of a seasoned character, like when she's talking to John Lithgow in the parking lot of the store, and she starts to scream at the kids to get in the car, and it's like, even though she's calling them honey, it's like the most aggressive delivery of that term of endearment you've ever heard. But there's certainly an understanding, especially up to this point, after just being through this nightmarish situation with this cashier screaming she doesn't have enough money from across the store. And as she's screaming at the older kid to get back in the car, it's sort of like the Louis C.K. bit where he talks about if you were to see a mother behaving like that towards a kid, and you're not a parent, you would think, oh, what a terrible mother screaming at her kid like that. But if you are a parent, your first thought is, how has that kid been torturing her all day, and how did... But, so you come to understand that pretty easily through her also. And then... And when it gets to, like, you know, the scenes with Lithgow, but before we get to that, it's probably important to talk about Flap, her husband with the stupid name, played by Jeff Daniels. And I don't know about Flap Horton, because the thing about him is that well, first off, I do think it was good on Brooks's part when he was adapting the novel into a screenplay that this doesn't go as far as it could have. It's to my understanding that obviously both of them have their own little affairs and all that, like her with Lithgow and him with his students or whatever. It is to my understanding that in the novel he actually goes as far as to have an affair with Patsy, like her best friend, which I think would have sort of... Because they do eventually get back to a point towards the end there, when she's in, like, her final moments, and she, you know, is just happy that they're talking to each other again, and you kind of see that love come back to them, and it's like, I feel like if they went that route, it's just like, they're just real... I mean, it's one thing for both of them to have their individual affairs, but that in particular seems like it would have just been a point of no return, and would have made him because I don't really care for Flap's character anyway, and so just as is without that. So I think it was smart on Brooks's part to sort of take that out. But I mean, even so, this character is... I'm really just not quite sure how we're intended to take him, let alone how I do anyway. Because it's like... Because we do get the sense that Aurora is a bit, you know, overbearing and intrusive in Emma's life and all that. And maybe possibly she's a bit overcritical of him, but... The thing is once we learn more things about him and see the way that he is, it's like, are we supposed to root for him when he's standing up to her, which is kind of what it feels like? Or are we supposed to realize that maybe she was right, at least to an extent? And it seems like, and maybe that's a way to play them up as human, because obviously everybody's flawed, and everybody's going to have, you know, there's certain things about them that are, you know, absolutely imperfect, but, I don't know, it's just, I just feel like it's really hard to like this dude in any sense, because even when we have those scenes towards the beginning, where he's just not putting up with our bullshit, and it's like, part of you wants to say, you know, yes, you know, he doesn't take our shit, that's great, and it allows them more room to be happy with, just with themselves and their marriage. But I don't know, there just still seems to be something, like, inherently jackassy about him. Particularly with, like, the fish dip or whatever that was. Just little moments like that, I feel like they're there for a reason. So it's like, we're kind of on his side there, but we're kind of on Aurora's side also. But, like I said, I'm sure it's to show the imperfections in humanity in general, but still, I find it really hard to gauge exactly... where to land with this character, particularly when they really go for it towards the middle, like when they think the baby's sick and the kids come in and tell them, and it's like he seems like he couldn't really give much of a shit, and like he's kind of the last one in there, and it seems like he's sort of tired of everything, and then it just happens to be in this moment he says, "Oh, by the way, we're moving to Nebraska," and it's like and it even gets to the point to where, I think it's Patsy that says, you know, like, why don't you just leave him? And we say, like, you know... But then at the same time, like I said, throwing in the Lithgow thing really makes this complicated in kind of an interesting way. Where, like I was saying, obviously, you know, Flap does hit some low points here, and there's also points where we're not quite sure if he's done anything or not. We do get the one scene where he kisses the student. It's one thing to kiss the student, but the fact that he's got the baby strapped to him is just like, what a fucker in this instance. But at the same time, it does make us realize that when she finds Lithgow at the store and something comes from that, and that basically, what's interesting, especially with the way the Lithgow character approaches this and his performance in general, it's almost like they add something like almost innocent-like to the adultery and the way the two of them approach it. To where it's like, they really make it seem genuine that the two of them need something that only the other can provide in this particular moment in a particular way. And it's not that I would ever, you know, advocate for adultery no matter how bad your situation is, because you can always get out of it first before you make another drastic decision. But it is a very interesting choice to have her character just sort of go ahead with it without knowing for sure if Flap has already gone to this extent with somebody else or not. And the fact that she even tells Lithgow straight up, genuinely, that this isn't really a payback thing for her, it's just sort of a passion thing. So it's, and I don't mean at all to take her side and say, you know, it's okay for her to do this, but Flap's a piece of shit. No, there's very much complication here, but I think it's more so that it feels really unexpected from her character, whereas, like I said, there's just sort of something about Flap that seems off anyway, like at the start, at least to me, whether that's intended or not. But no, obviously, you know, they're both gonna have those two different lives. Like I said, it also makes it complicated that we don't really know 100%. Especially with Flap saying when he gets caught kissing the girl that they haven't gone that far as she has, for instance. So in a sense, that makes her worse, but there's still just... is sort of like there's love there, but it's sort of like a fucked marriage, really. But the fact that they do stick it out and we do get those moments where it sort of comes back to them just in those moments, and that's kind of where she's happiest, that the fact that they were able to get to that point before they couldn't anymore. And then when we see, like, you know, Flap's inner turmoil coming out, it's so weird to keep saying his name in such a dramatic context. It does show just how conflicted his character is, and that he's not just some, you know, straightforward douchebag we should root against. And I suppose that's, you know, a lot of credit to Jeff Daniels' performance also. But like I said, what Lithgow also brings to the other side sort of really makes it feel complicated how we should feel about what she's doing also. Lithgow, by the way, going on his, this was his second consecutive Oscar nomination for, like, I think he shot it for 3 days while he was on a break from shooting Footloose. And he was replacing somebody else. So it's like, it's crazy he could come in and make such a memorable character with such a small amount of time in the movie and in preparation to do so as well. So, and then on top of all that, we've also got some realism in regards to like just like from the kids' perspective also, where surely a lot of us have experience being the kids, particularly the two brothers, just kind of sitting outside while the parents fight inside and then walking away and going elsewhere. I may or may not be alluding to the fact that that is like a situation right out of real life from a long, long time ago. That just sort of feels really real and hits you in this real spot if you've been in a similar situation. But then, on top of all this, obviously, the point that we're going towards this whole time is Darabinga's character being diagnosed with cancer, which obviously, Terms of Endearment is now considered like one of the, you know, ultimate famous tearjerker movies, but at the time, not knowing that, for those audiences, obviously, I wouldn't be alive for another 7 years when this movie's out, but when I did see Terms of Endearment for the first time, which was when I was actually tracking it, I grew up with Steel Magnolias, so I knew everything about it, but Terms of Endearment I had to track down myself when I was in like my early teens and I was trying to see all the Best Picture winners. I had no idea that's the direction this movie went, so it was actually like genuinely shocking because it's just so sudden and you really don't see it going in that direction if you don't know already. And it's one of those cases where like you're not really sure which direction it is going, but then it just sort of hits you like a brick wall. And that's another thing too in regards to me saying it feels like the movie's constantly on fast forward the way it goes through the years. And it's like it is the way this is presented where it's like it does feel like it's intentionally going faster and faster and faster like that until you just suddenly stop and you hit this wall that this brings in. And sort of brings out that effect also, and it's like, and yeah, like it basically, unless I'm really forgetting something, obviously the tearjerker has been around since the beginning of time, but as far as like the tearjerker that we know it to be today, seems like it was birthed through Terms of Endearment, because you've got like, obviously Steel Magnolias in there. I want to say somewhere in between these, chronologically, was Beaches. And it's like somewhere in here we basically gave birth to the Lifetime movie and the Hallmark movie and stuff like that. So thanks. But, but still, the fact that it was able to do that, because the thing about this is that I understand how Brooks's approach was to basically see it as a comedy that had this, just has this tragedy in it. But when you see it and you do know the direction it's going, it does feel like a totally different movie, and there is like a sort of constant sadness, because there's that whole thing where when you see the movie the first time and you don't know where it's going, you see all these colorful characters come in, you see DeVito with his cowboy hat just watching, or you see Breedlove come in and out and do his thing, and all these people that come in and out of her life. And the thing is like when you're watching it again, all you're doing is seeing, like, we're meeting all the people that are just heading down the road to ultimately being at Emma's funeral. And it's just sort of like we're watching the ultimate, you know, crowd for her funeral gather slowly as they work their way into the lives of the main characters. And there's just this constant tragic, just sort of aura around it. So, But either way, it does still work. Every now and then, it is broken up because let's say because you've got the whole tragic area of Winger being on her deathbed, and especially the moment where it's like obviously we have the moments where she reconciles with Flap, and then obviously talking to Aurora and all that, and how the way Aurora deals with it also with all the people coming back into her life like Breedlove, but then this moment that's just inevitable, like where you can just feel the anxiety of the inevitability of this heartbreaking moment that has to happen, where she has to bring the kids in and basically say goodbye to them. Where it's, and obviously this is like ultimate, tearjerker stuff that really does work, without feeling too sort of like, overly manipulative or whatever. Every now and then there is something that sort of breaks this up a little bit. Like one scene I've ridiculed since the first time I saw it was I mean, obviously it's a scene that really turns around and it's in a big emotional moment for both these characters. But the moment when they're talking about the Boy Scouts as Aurora's walking away with the kids, and Tommy, I think is his name, the older one, says that Winger was too lazy to get them involved. And Shirley MacLaine slaps him to the point that he, like, rolls and, like, almost backflips. It feels really over the top and dramatic, particularly for a moment that's, like, so close to the end, like, when the emotional moment should really be as, real and potent as possible. That's always stood out to me in a weird way, and sort of gives it that much more, like, soap opera-y vibe that it's really successfully, for the most part, avoiding while dealing with this material. But overall, though, it is like considered one of those, one of the ultimate emotional movies, regardless of, how some people may think it's a bit dated, especially with what the tearjerker really has. It's basically become a joke of a genre at this point. But nevertheless, like I said, if you go back to the way we see them today, you'll probably end up at about here when you get all the way back. So, like I said, even though tearjerkers have been around since the 30s and 40s, whatever, but yeah. And obviously, even if it gave birth to those, we can kind of indirectly thank Terms of Endearment for something else. Weirdly enough, which is obviously, if you're not aware of, his movie, James L. Brooks' movies, like, Broadcast News, As Good as It Gets, and all that, all these other Oscar-winning and nominated movies following this one, or his TV work from prior to this movie, because this was his debut as a feature-length movie, and apparently for completing his first feature-length movie, he was given a gift after a production wrapped of a book, and these books happen to have drawings in them by Matt Groening. And so when he saw those, he was like, oh, well, these would really be good in the Tracy Ullman show that I'm doing and all that, which, of course, eventually took us to The Simpsons. So in some weird, indirect way, we have Terms of Endearment to thank for The Simpsons. So there is that, too. And that's pretty much all I really have to say about Terms of Endearment. It's like, it doesn't really hit me in the big emotional way it probably did in '83, but also does with particular audiences, especially audiences where, like I was saying, more so for me with like the kids and the parents and all that, hits them in a real big personal way also. So that's really what I have to say about it. So going on to Steel Magnolias, there is actually. We might kind of start on the somber note as opposed to getting there gradually, but the one thing I sort of noticed right off that I always found a bit interesting was when you watch Steel Magnolias and you see like all the southern women around the salon and all that, and they're like gossiping and doing all that sort of thing, throwing out their lines to each other and all that, the memorable, quotable lines for the most part. It's a little surprising to learn that about the name I mentioned earlier, Robert Harling, and the fact that all of this comes from the mind of a guy, more or less. But the thing here is that you might think that this seems like sort of an odd genre and a sort of odd group of characters for that. Not to say it's not impossible or anything, but it might be unexpected the place in which this comes from, is what I'm saying. Which is, it's to my understanding that the reason this play and ultimately this movie came to be was that his sister had also gotten sick and died in a similar fashion of Shelby in the movie, to the point that Shelby is based on her. And I guess it was this whole thing where when she was like in her final moments, he was saying that he didn't know what he could do because he was a struggling writer. He wasn't getting anywhere. He was like, you know, stuck in New York with like no other way to go, and just seemed like at rock bottom more or less. And his sister said that she had wished there was something that she could do. So after she died, it inspired him to write this, with the Shelby character basically being her in a sense, and his career just took off from there. So she ended up helping him anyway. And then there's also the moment where some of those, like when you read up on it, I'm assuming, I would hate to, as personal, as deeply personal as it is to this guy, I would hate to just say something I read as if it's true, but I'm going to assume there's truth in another fact that I read supposedly about this is when the scene where she's, you know, on her deathbed and they pull the life support and all that. His mother was on the set that day, and they asked her if she wanted to leave the room during this scene. But she said that she wanted to be able to watch Shelby get up after it was all over, like get up and walk away from her bed after this. Sort of like this cathartic thing. So it's like, it does just seem like a movie of, you know, just another tearjerker movie similar to Terms of Endearment, but when it really comes from such a personal place as that, it sort of helps you see it from a different perspective. But going on that also, as I said, this is an adaptation of a play, so there might be moments that sort of feel like that. Maybe possibly too much, because there's always going to be that the whole filmed as a play criticism if it doesn't expand on it enough. And it does work really well with sort of like these sort of one set ideas, not like necessarily one area, but like when you think about the fact that the whole wedding scene, like the build up to it and then the wedding itself and the reception, all is like the entire first 45 minutes of the movie. Like that's almost half of the movie just already gone in just that one particular setting. But then as it goes on, like I said, they do have, you know, they gossip, they do the quotable lines and all that. And because of this, it may feel like, we were talking about the realism in terms of Endearment, this one may feel less real and less human because the characters feel more like they're characters, you know, reading a clever script as opposed, and a witty script as opposed to, you know, something that seems more sort of genuine between them. But that's not to say that they don't absolutely bring that and do add a certain, because that's more so in their words. There is, you know, more to these performances than necessarily just that. Which is also really interesting because not only are they a perfect cast that go perfectly together, but the fact that they were able to pull this off with, and not to take away from what I assume Herbert Ross as the director really brought to this movie, with a number of successful movies behind him and after this, but the fact that when you read up on it, there seemed to be like a real animosity between him towards the cast, to the point that I read that like Julia Roberts was like often in tears because of it. And he was saying like how none of them could act, despite the fact that a few of them were already Oscar winners. In Sally Field's case, a 2-time winner, and Julia Roberts would go on to get her first nomination for this, go figure. And the fact that they were able to make a movie that feels like, just really has that sort of, you know, home-like feel to it, despite that, I think really says something about what really both all of them and he was doing as a director, that they were able to get to that point regardless of all that. So it definitely does not show at all when you watch it. So, but speaking of the perfect cast, you also can't help but sort of wonder about what this movie could have been, where apparently Bette Davis had seen the play and really thought that she was suited for Weezer, the Shirley MacLaine part, and she was going to get like Katharine Hepburn to be Clary and get Elizabeth Taylor to be Truvy, but by the time she went to go get the rights, they'd already been taken, and they said they were going to use a significantly younger cast. And so it's like, you do kind of wonder how different the movie would have been, and how much more of a maybe classic feel it would have had. Despite the classic feel that these actresses bring themselves already, I still wonder how different the movies would have felt. But regardless of that, there are going to be some, not just the overall plot, but other similarities in terms of Endearment, where this movie maybe feels like maybe it cuts a little bit deeper than Terms of Endearment, believe it or not. Like, for instance, we'll have similar scenes where after the wedding, there'll be some time passing, and then Winger or Julia Roberts will tell their mother that they're pregnant. And where Aurora, in Terms of Endearment, really had this, standoffish response to that, and, that's the worst way to go. We know the reason for that with Aurora's character, whereas in this, the reason Sally Field responds that way is because of the potential health issue, where it's like it feels like it's sort of the same moment, but coming from totally different places. And like I said, there's something that sort of gives it a bit more depth, that it's more of a fear for Roberts' health, where Field's coming from with that response to that. Which I would say for the most part does make it more effective dramatically in that sense. Even if it might maybe seem a bit easier to give it more of a reason than just Aurora doesn't want that to happen. To give Field much more of an urgent reason to say this, you really shouldn't do this. Obviously it does maybe, in scenes like this, particularly when they have their big moment arguing about this, the movie does tend to maybe be a bit more, in that feel like almost soap opera-y vibe, even if, Terms of Endearment feels like it practically created that for this new decade. But I still think the performances, especially Roberts in that particular moment, really stands out, where she says the most memorable line in the movie. The 30 minutes of wonderful over a lifetime of nothing special line really... Scenes like that really stick, regardless of how melodramatic they might end up getting. Because I know some people have actually surprising to me a little bit, have said that they found this movie to be a bit dated, in regards to, even more so than Terms of Endearment, weirdly. Where the scenes more so just feel like, these sort of disconnected, individual moments as opposed to being this whole thing, and we're just sort of waiting for the tragedy to happen. I've never really seen the movie that way, and I do feel like that, also, much like Terms of Endearment, it's got a really fast pace to it, but I also feel like it doesn't feel like it's skipping a bunch of stuff in the way Terms of Endearment kind of feels like. It doesn't feel like it's going too fast, and it feels like it has a purpose for doing that. Particularly when, it gets to the point to where we know she's, really early in the pregnancy, and then Field has the line, nothing pleases Shelby more than proving me wrong. And in that, immediately following that line is the jump in time to show that Shelby did prove her wrong, but not only did she prove her wrong about the fact that the pregnancy and all that would be fine, but that they've gone as far as to the kid is pretty much, talking at this point, and still things seem to be fine, and that they've gone that far. Which, of course, also does get us closer to the tragedy quicker, but still, it does feel like a much more sort of... organic jump in time, as opposed to the really quick ones that we get in Terms of Endearment. And as far as the other characters go, which I should probably go more into, obviously most of them sort of... It's sort of one of those cases where if you were to just see a line on paper out of context, the characters are so distinguished that you would probably know who's saying the line, even if all you had was it written down. But you do have characters that do have particular arcs. Not all of them, obviously, but sometimes, in the case of, Dolly Parton or Olympia Dukakis, they don't really need their own personal arc because the character just works through them, just in general. But then you have, Shirley MacLaine, who doesn't really completely break out, because it would be, this character always kind of had to be, the meanest woman in town, because if she had sort of showed too much of a soft side, that would have just sucked, and it would have been really weak. But the fact that she's able to maintain that, but also bring humanity to it, particularly in the scene when she's talking about, after they've really learned just how south Shelby's health is going, but just before that she had said something akin to, I just, sometimes I wish my body would shut down or something, or I hope that my body just gives out or whatever. And then when they're in the store later, and she has, this real human moment we haven't seen from her yet, where she says, I really shouldn't have said that, I'm a terrible person, and she, genuinely feels that. And we also sort of see that through her relationship with Tom Skerritt throughout, which is only shown in like these little fleeting moments as they walk by each other, but it's like, I wouldn't go as far as to call it a love-hate relationship, but more like a loving-hate relationship, if that makes sense. And then when she's talking with Clary, like after the funeral and all that, and them just sort of obviously knowing where the other's coming from, and like I said, basically staying within their characters, even if, like I said, she's the meanest woman in town, the most endearing thing that she could possibly do is just be herself, because that's just who they know and who that person is. So that comes through a lot. And Daryl Hannah does go through some drastic, if brief, changes with the whole starting off like really meek with the glasses and stuff like that. Then she kind of tries the whole contacts thing, but then goes back to her normal self, and then becomes some religious nut. I feel like there's maybe some missing parts to this, though there is kind of a nice, sweet love story between her and Kevin J. O'Connor, just really on the side. But it never really strays too far from the center of the story itself, which is the relationship between Field and Roberts anyway. We do have the men of the story kind of on the sidelines. I think I read somewhere that the men are actually not actually there physically in the play, and this was basically more of like a movie expansion, and you can kind of tell, like, it does seem like they're basically sort of there to like maybe fill in the blanks. They're only there because it would be weird in the movie if they weren't. But every now and then we do get like a genuine moment. The scene that's always really stuck out to me is, you can say that Dylan McDermott just sort of comes in and out of the movie, sort of being insignificant, but the one shot of him leaving the funeral with people like guiding him away has always really struck me as like this, where it just looks like all life has been drained out of him, like really shows the tragedy within their family, just that one shot of him. So I always thought that was really well done, even if brief. And like I said, those, fleeting moments with Tom Skerritt, more so with Shirley MacLaine than Sally Field, weirdly enough. And then, the scenes with Sam Shepard and Dolly Parton stand out also, but yeah, but then it ultimately gets to the tragedy itself, which probably doesn't quite hit as hard as maybe in terms of Endearment, strictly because it doesn't come out of left field the way that did. We sort of grasp early on that Shelby has a problem, and the way we sort of eventually get to that point, it's like, much like the characters in the movie, we kind of see it coming from a great distance, but through the whole movie we know it's inevitable, which probably helps a little bit, for lack of a better way to put it, really. But the really interesting thing about this movie is, I mentioned earlier that while I had to seek out Terms of Endearment myself, I grew up on Steel Magnolias because my mom would watch it like constantly. So the interesting thing for me as like a very small child seeing Steel Magnolias is the funeral scene was really stuck out in a way, because I'd already lost like a couple of relatives at this point and had gone to funerals and stuff like that. I knew how somber and serious they were, and to see this movie where this big dramatic scene happens where Sally Field has her big monologue, and then this just big comedic scene breaks out in the middle of it, and the fact that everyone's laughing by the end of this before they've left the cemetery, and my parents are laughing because the whole thing, and it's like, it was this really jarring thing that I didn't quite understand at the time. Like, it was my first look at not only like using laughter to grieve and stuff like that, but also the way movies could blend like comedy and drama, the way Brooks had set out to do with Terms of Endearment. Was such an odd thing to me, and like, to the point that I really could not comprehend, is it funny or is it sad? Like, for some reason my small brain at the time couldn't comprehend that both can happen at the same time, and that was, so Steel Magnolias was like my first real grasp of that. So regardless of how much the movie may date or whatever, that's like, it'll always have that significance to me. So it's really hard to say how I would feel about it, like if I saw it now. Especially with this being a grasping of genres that many people have done at this point. So yeah, so I'm always going to kind of have that, I guess bias, or that soft spot for Steel Magnolias. Like I said, there are things that I do think it handles a bit better than Terms of Endearment does, despite the pedestal that Terms of Endearment kind of has always sat on. So not just being a multiple Oscar winner, but sort of, like I said, being the new birth of a particular genre of sorts, I guess you could say. So, yeah, I mean, so if I had to choose between the two, I would probably, you know, stick with Steel Magnolias, but like I said, that may just be the fact that it made an impact on me very early in life, where Terms of Endearment didn't quite have that same, you know, advantage, so yeah, I think that's what these two are. So the next one, I'm actually going to be meshing the blunt segment with verses for the next segment, and then we'll go on to some more winter-themed ones, so, and then everything will pretty much be going as usual. So until all that stuff